Thank you all for joining us. I hope you can all hear me okay. Do a little sound check. We're okay? Good, good. Thank you. And I'm delighted to be able to join you once again. I have a little familial help here with my daughter, Ariella, who's visiting. And she will be providing any technical assistance that is necessary, in addition to Lydia, of course. I'm happy that we have a chance to do a part 2 of our Taste of the Greats. And again, really what this is about is trying to create a kind of a story. I've always been drawn to Jewish thinkers who try to make sense out of the whole thing. Judaism is such a vast and varied experience that it lends itself towards people who want to specialize in one section or another of our experience as Jews and our tradition. But how to make sense out of the whole picture is, I think, at the end of the day, a great service that some wonderful people have done for us. So we're going to continue along that line. Next week, we also will have the pleasure of having Rabbi Zeren join us for a depiction, or at least a taste of one of the great modern female Jewish thinkers. We wanted to make sure we had at least one feminine voice in the midst of all of these other individuals. And Tikva Frimer-Kansky, who will be presented. So we're looking forward to that. And last week, we had a chance to really touch upon this whole spirit of change as we entered the modern world, and how Moses Mendelssohn and how Franz Rosenzweig and how Martin Buber dealt with it in very unique ways. And what I'd like to do tonight is to extend that. We have a little bit of a, not a pinch hitter exactly, but somebody I've thrown into the mix that I, on reflection, thought should be added into it. And we'll get to that in just a moment. Before we do that, it's important to just take a moment and mention that we were speaking about how when the world began to open up and there were Jews trying to pry it open so that there could be emancipation, so that there could be some room for modern expression, a lot of this ultimately wound up being crystallized into what we call Jewish denominations. It's not the case that our denominations were always there, and we are very much living in what people often call today a post-denominational world. But for quite a long time, the way in which this Jewish world, at least in America, has been organized was along the lines of how you see yourself. Are you an Orthodox Jew, a conservative Jew, a Reform Jew, a Reconstructionist Jew, something else? But we had the 3, maybe the 4 major delineations where people would find a kind of home for themselves. And the question is, of course, a little bit about why that happened. And that's not our main focus, but a few words about that are, I think, in order. The experience of lots of upheaval and change in the 19th century, especially, created an opening for people to say, we have to do things differently. So if you think back to your high school history or college history classes, the year 1815 comes along the way, and Napoleon is defeated. The French Revolution is, in essence, put to an extent to an end. And not only do the forces at work in Europe say, well, this was too much, this was dangerous, this was excessive, they said, no Jewish emancipation in Central Europe. And what Jews did in response to that was to say, we need to be able to present ourselves as Western civilization representatives of the Jewish world. It's not just that we think it's a nice idea, it's an imperative so that the world will see Judaism as a very clear, universal faith that is very much in keeping with the rest of the religious expressions of Europe. And maybe then the powers that be will also accept us. And it's not just simply that this was for political purposes. It was a genuinely developed idea that resulted in what we would come to know as Reform Judaism. And in the process of that, some very interesting things happened. Abraham Geiger arguably was the father of Reform Judaism, one of its chief beginning individuals, really had an agenda. One of the things he did was he engaged in an intellectual debate with the Christian world at the time, who in many respects were trying to say how negative, how terrible at faith Judaism was, certainly compared to the exalted faith of Christianity. So Geiger, using the tools of his expression at that time, his historical knowledge, came to the conclusion and taught the conclusion that not only was Jesus a Jew, Jesus was a Pharisee, that very group that New Testament literature so often vilifies. And in the course of time, it was only later Christianity that moved away from the purer, more open, more developed idea that Jesus had as a Pharisee. What were the Pharisees? In his mind, they were a liberal group who constantly sought to reinterpret Jewish scripture in light of new ideas, in light of various things that one would learn from other disciplines, in order to keep Judaism live and vibrant and well. He also had another agenda, which was attached to that. And that agenda was to say, we need to show that that is the exact process Judaism should follow. Judaism should recover the spirit of the original Pharisees, which was always open to change, always open to development, and to use all of the tools that we have to uncover that in the course of time. Because especially in the 19th century, there came to be these very clear emphases on science of Judaism approaches, Wissenschaft des Judentums. Let's use archaeology and philology, knowledge of the ancient Near East that we can find from other sources, languages, anthropology, all the ologies that are out there, and paint the picture of what Judaism was all about. And when he did that, and others did that, they said, well, here's this book called the Bible, which they took to be initially a very secular kind of text, written by human beings, reflecting all sorts of other ideas in the ancient world, uniquely Jewish in some respects, but not necessarily so unique. That's what certainly the non-Jewish world was saying. But Geiger said, no, let's understand it. And the spirit of the Pharisees was to take that which was a kernel of goodness in the Hebrew Bible, not the things that were uniquely and exclusively Jewish, not the dietary laws, not circumcision, not the ritual means, certainly not sacrifice, but the higher, what he called the ethical, the prophetic kind of values, the kinds of things that everyone could kind of wrap their arms around. And so he promoted this. The first Reformed temple comes in 1810, a little bit before Napoleon bites the dust in that regard. And the Pittsburgh platform, which comes much later on, is a reflection of some of these ideas. What do they want to create? They want to create a kind of religion that anybody could identify with and respect. No longer is Judaism the religion of the Jews, and if you want to become an adherent of that, you have to join the Jewish people, but it's something respectable, developed, interesting, and to that end, German should come and replace Hebrew. Worship should be modernized so that women and men sit together. There should be, and this was very, very controversial, the introduction of German as part of the sermon. A German sermon is in congregational worship, which was more controversial in some places than the organ. And to say that we look at Torah and scripture as being a progressive revelation, but fundamentally it's a human creation. And most important, no longer is there an adherence to the national ideals of the Jewish experience. Stuttgart is our Jerusalem, the reformers would say. The very use of the word temple is telling, because the word temple is something that speaks to there no longer being a temple with a big capital T in Jerusalem. That's been destroyed, but now we have its replacement. Its replacement is in all of these various cities throughout Europe, wherever it happens to be. That becomes a key and important teaching and an important idea. So that's one element. And it's very important to note that in many respects, the other denominations are a response to reform. Orthodoxy, called neo-orthodoxy, is a response to reform. Nobody in the 16th century woke up one day and said, how wonderful it is to be an Orthodox Jew. Nobody used the term. It didn't exist. One was a traditional Jew. And it's been said that the real definition of a traditional Jew is someone who doesn't know that they are one. It was just a naturally kind of part of one's expression, and it didn't have any kind of other ideological label. It just was. But the development of what comes to be known as neo-Orthodoxy under Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, who was its real founder, he lived in 1808, 1888. He really, really believed that it was possible to have traditional Jewish life with derech eretz, as he called, the ways of the world, but that the Torah is infallible. It is from God. It is divine. And here's the key thing. Unlike others who said, we have to change with the times, Hirsch and his fellows said, if the times and change are at odds with each other, then it's the times that have to change, not Judaism. He flipped the script. He flipped the script. And in many respects, conservative Judaism, which was called historical Judaism in Europe, and it's a terrible name, this word conservative, because it doesn't serve any accurate kind of expression of what really comes to be, but it's conservative in the sense of there were moderate reformers who said the reform movement went too far. We have to moderate it. We especially don't like the idea of changing and getting rid of Hebrew or minimizing Hebrew. Hebrew was sacrosanct in their minds. And when we get to people like Zecharia Frankel, who's really the founder of conservative, what he called historical Judaism in Europe, it was all about maintaining the core of Jewish expression, but putting Hebrew and peoplehood first. So here's what I'd like to do by means of a couple of charts that I'd like to share with you. All of the denominations, especially as they entered the 20th century, valued three elements: a notion of God, a notion of Torah or sacred scripture, and what was called Israel. Not the state of Israel, not the land of Israel, but Jewish peoplehood. God, Torah, and Israel. So how did that get expressed? Can you all hopefully see this? Okay, very good. So here is really the statement of reform. And all of three were important elements, but we already mentioned Israel as peoplehood has already taken a different kind of place. It's not Jewish peoplehood as a national entity that matters. That's why reform was not Zionistic. And this is all something that changed radically over time. So please do not take this as present reality, but it's where we were in the 19th century as it comes to an end. So, and Torah was something that is developed, something that is organic to the elements of change, because people are an important element of that. But it's God that really is at the pinnacle, because the belief in God was very clear. It was very much there. And Reformed Judaism spoke constantly of the God idea in the Jewish world. And some of the other things that would be subject to change in the early years of Reform. And if you want an element of that, some of you have memory here. It's really Rabbi Feldman at Beth Israel before Rabbi Silver came. It was the idea that there would be a clear expression of change as a necessity, as a good, as a salvational good for the Jewish people. And a part of that would be to retain God, but other elements should be as flexible and should change as well. That's why I'm told Beth Israel actually had a place underneath the seats when the building was first constructed for men to put their hats, because they would not be caught wearing them there. They didn't want to be, the rabbi there did not want them to be wearing hats, any kind of head covering. That was a statement of principle, just as there would be other elements that came into the Reform world as well. But okay, here we go. This is what the Orthodox world looked like at the beginning of the 20th century. It was certainly a strong belief in God, certainly a strong belief in the centrality of the Jewish people, but the emphasis on Torah and education and reviewing it and learning over and over again from countless angles with the full gargantuan body of Jewish commentary was that expression, and it is the guideline and the guidepost of the Jewish world, and in many respects it is to this day. An aside, a footnote, the Orthodox world this day is the movement of the denomination of the various ones that is the most diverse and is the most dynamic in terms of what's going on in that world. It has a range of expression that is really, really remarkable and is worthy of appreciation and study, and that's a course unto itself. And conservative. The certainly belief in God, certainly belief in Torah. Torah as a statement of that which emerges from not only divine revelation, but human perception. We'll get to that in a minute, but Israel, peoplehood. The beginnings of the conservative Jewish world was always Zionistic from the get-go, always with the sense of the people of Israel being the core concern of what takes place in the Jewish expression, and how sacred really the idea of history, the history of the Jewish world was, and how to understand how that too is something that made for who we are to this very, very day. And with that, let's move on to some of our folks for the day. Solomon Schechter. I always like to say that the order of what happens here is important. He was not named after the schools came after he did. This is somebody who was, as you can see perhaps from the sense of the picture of who he was an individual born in Romania. He had from 1847, as you can see, raised in a very interesting background. He began as a Chabad rabbi or Chabad individual, Chabad trained Jew. He was not satisfied with what he learned in that world, and he went to a school called the Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentums, the School of Higher Education for the Science of Judaism. Note the title, Science of Judaism. There he would study Talmud. There he would become so versed in Talmud that he became an instructor in it a little later on. And he was someone who was credited with this incredible discovery in 1897 of what's known as the Cairo Geniza. The Cairo Geniza was a large room filled with dust, as all the depictions have it, with well over 100,000 pages of texts that he recovered, brought back to Cambridge, and reconstructed so that he found books that were never found before and helped us to understand what our other texts were all about, shed light on them. And again, because of the sense of scholarship and Torah being at the center of everything. He in time would be courted to come to New York. He would be the leader of JTS. He was a religious moderate. And he came to believe that there had to be a different way from reform. It was too radical. And he, at the same time, believed very strongly in some very key ideas that we'll take a look at right now. Key ideas from Solomon Schechter. When you study Jewish history, it's not just that you learn about the people. You see the flow of God through our experience. You see the sense that there is a kind of divine hand that permeates our experience and allows us to continue to go on. If a temple is destroyed, the one in Jerusalem in the year 70 of the Common Era, it doesn't mean the end of Judaism, because God is revealed in the next stage, the ability of Jews to survive in exile. Torah is absolutely the core issue, and Judaism is incompatible with what he would call the abandonment of the Torah. However, here's the peoplehood idea. Judaism evolves through this collective consciousness, if you will, of what he called Catholic Israel. It's a very unusual phrase. It's not the kind of thing we normally use. It's the idea that this collective body of the Jewish people as a whole is also a means of understanding revelation, and it promotes new ideas as to how we ought to be as Jews. Others would amend it a little bit to say Catholic Israel is really that core group of individuals who identify themselves as Jewish, but it's something that very much speaks to the power of peoplehood in creating what Judaism is going to be, as long as it doesn't really supersede the Torah itself. But it's a very important companion. One of the phrases in the Talmud very often is pok chazeh, go and see what the people are doing. What is it that they can do? One example that's often given is at a time in which there was a permissibility on the part of early sages to consume milk products along with fowl. And some came along and said, it's a little bit close to meat for comfort. Maybe we should create a stricture around that. The argument there was, had that been not something the Jewish people as a whole could have really taken on and assumed, we might have been having a lot more chicken marinade, chicken parmesan. Thanks, Ariel. Chicken parmesan in our diets in terms of kashrut. That is the way, and this is the real important claim. It's not that Schechter would come and say, it's nice that we should change because change is important and it's important. He says it's always been this way. If you study Jewish history, there's been a dynamism to it. There's been an element of change. That is one of the key elements that has led him to be a prime beginner, if you will, of conservative Judaism on these shores. And he really believed, and this is his claim to fame, that what really, really mattered is that you have congregations in support of having a school. In time, he created the United Synagogue, 800 congregations, not as many now, but he really, really believed that that would be the key idea. He wound up creating a movement, though he didn't really start out wanting to do that, but he created a movement, and we'll talk about in other venues, in other kind of frameworks, what that has all meant in the future, for our future. Now, here is something that I'd like to move to, which was not my original plan, but the more I thought about it, the more I really had to think about this as part of what we're doing here. Now, you may think this is a little bizarre, but I'm pretty sure that most of us here, if not all of us here, have spent a little time in this place. If you haven't been there lately, it's a very nice place. It's worth spending some time. The Jewish Community Center, not just the one that happens to grace the greater Hartford area, but throughout the country. So if you have had any contact with this place, you have a thinker to thank for that. Now, not only did JCCs as places for Jewish gathering take place, for there to be everything from lectures to sports and crafts and art and dance and everything else, synagogues adopted the same name. This happens to be the East Meadow Jewish Center. I chose this particular slide for two reasons. One is it was one of the few places I could find that had the name Jewish Center kind of embodied in it, though it's not so clear. It's also the place where Nancy and I got married, so I figured that was a sign that I should use the slide. Synagogues began to use the term center. Many of you, I'm sure, have had contact with or grew up in places where the synagogue name involved the name center. Why? Well, when you entered into it, you found more going on there than a school and more going on there than a chapel and a place for worship. You found, in all likelihood, a place where you could play basketball, or there would be an art class, or there would be music, and there would be dance, and there would be all sorts of expressions that weren't necessarily, strictly speaking, religious. But that was a very important part of that expression. So if you have familiarity and comfort with that, you have our next thinker to thank for that. If any of you have read this book, shifting gears a little bit, Kushner's When Bad Things Happen to Good People, a big national bestseller, and it still continues to be so, and you found any comfort in it at all, especially with the idea that when things happen that are disastrous and painful and hurtful and there is suffering, it is not God punishing us for that, because that is not the way God operates. God does not cause hurricanes and all of the other kinds of natural expressions, never mind the things that human beings bring upon each other. God is the goodness of healing, and it is nature and randomness that still remains that is the culprit when it comes to these things. But God is what helps us to heal from all of those painful experiences. So if you have had any familiarity with that at all, you have our next thinker to thank for that as well. And that thinker is Mordechai Kaplan. He lived for a ripe old age, 102. And I actually had the pleasure of meeting him 3 times. Once was at a lecture where he was brilliant and vivid in everything he had to say. Once was at his synagogue in Jerusalem, which had the title, and this is telling, Mevakshe Derech, which means those who seek a path. Not Bethel, where we know God exists or lives, and not the house of Jacob, or not any of the other kinds of names of synagogues, which are very clear in terms of this is our identity and this is the solid reality of what we're expressing here, but rather we're looking for a path. And I also got to spend a little time with him in his sunset years when he was a resident at the Hebrew Home for the Aged in Riverdale, where I was doing my social work training. And I would sit down with him from time to time, though at that point it was pretty hard to converse with him, but something that sparked in him really, really came through. So who was Cap? He came from a very traditional, I'll leave this up because I want you to look at it anyhow, came from a very traditional family in Lithuania. And when he made his way over here, he came to realize how radically different the American reality was. And he truly believed that there was a whole other set of realities to Judaism that had to be uncovered. Now, he was a very high achiever. He founded the Young Israel movement for Orthodoxy. He taught at the Jewish Theological Seminary for 50 years, 50 years, and he created what became at first an offshoot of conservative Judaism known as Reconstructionism, but ultimately what really became a separate group, excuse me, altogether. And he was as a personality, very, very vivacious, always impeccably dressed. And he taught homiletics. He taught rabbis how to do sermons. So one of the zillions of stories told about him was that he listened to a sermon that a student gave on a Monday, said, very fine, you did a fine job, young man, very nice. I want you to give it again on Wednesday. And he gave the same sermon on Wednesday as instructed to the class, and Kaplan tore him apart. He criticized him mercilessly. And the student said, I don't understand. It was the same sermon I gave on Monday. Why is it that you're criticizing me now? And he said, in the last 2 days, young man, I have grown and I have changed. Why haven't you? That's the kind of sense that he imbibed. He grew up in a milieu that said that the world is marching towards change, towards improvement. And he said, and this is the key element that everybody that I know has really believed has been his key contribution as a sociological statement. Judaism is not a religion per se. It is an evolving religious civilization of the Jewish people. Each of those terms is important. It's a civilization. That's why we can have what we would hear as the shul with the pool. We would have the center idea, the notion that there would be all sorts of activities that make for a civilization, which is latest in dance trends and film and music and all of the things we mentioned before, arts and sports and everything else. But it has been largely informed, if not almost overwhelmingly informed, by the religious experience of the Jewish world throughout history. But the key term here is that it evolves. It always, always evolves. That's where people said, you know what, he's onto something very, very important. But he was theologically very avant-garde. No longer is God some supernatural being out there. God is much more naturalistic. God is the sum total, he would say, of the forces in the universe that make, should be one without the S, for salvation. That when you take and combine the doctor's skill, the artist's talent, the friend's readiness to be with another friend in a time of need, a parent's great patience with an ill child, all of these wonderful, glorious things, you put them together, you get basically the experience of God. And this wasn't just an idea. He took it very, very seriously. But as other adherents of this would say, you don't necessarily start talking about where is God, you talk about when is God. When there is love, there is God. When there is compassion, there is God. And because of that, you would have an expression that would be tremendously important in terms of the implications. Because of the idea that God is naturalistic within this world and not outside of it in some far off heaven or other location. But then there are other ideas that have to come to be. he took the Torah as purely a human document inspired by a sense of the godly in the world. But because of that, it's always open to change. Mitzvot, just to skip down for a minute, are not obligatory acts, but they're important. They're important because they're folkways, they're minhagim, they're customs, not divine demands. The things that allow us to grow when we're voluntarily choosing them. Just as Reform was very keen on the idea of autonomy, personal choice. Here too, they had to be freely chosen, but he was much more involved in the idea of peoplehood and the Jewish people concept than Reform was. That was his criticism of Reform. And he said, it's time to drop Jews as the chosen people. It's not an idea that can possibly be maintained in our world today. So when Kaplanian friends and devotees would come up to the Torah, they wouldn't recite the Torah blessing that we would commonly recite, Asher Bachar Banu, God who chose us from all people, but rather it would be God who has drawn us close to God's service. Very different. And Aleinu, not thank you, God, for making us special, but rather thank you, God, for planting within us the seeds of eternity. There is no external world to come. The world to come, and this is something that many, many people believe today. This has been very influential. How often do we hear people saying, we really don't have a sense or believe that there's heaven and hell, but we believe that there is immortality in the way a loved one is maintained in our minds and our hearts. So he has been remarkably influential. You may not agree with him, but the power of his influence is great. And by the way, he was very, very influential on a whole host of conservative rabbis who were trying to find their way in the modern world and were confounded by some of the challenges they found in traditional belief. Kaplan made it safe to have other ideas that were reflections of a more naturalistic idea. God is within us on a broad scale, in essence. Okay. Now, I want to just spend a little bit of time on the non-Kaplan. And this will be our last individual for the day. But I wanted to show the range of what happens when certain people come at certain times. And because timing is everything, I wanted to spend a little time on Abraham Joshua Heschel. Heschel, like Kaplan, was a major part of the Jewish Theological Seminary, though not for nearly as long, and also has been remarkably influential on the experience of many, many Jews, but also his influence extends far beyond the Jewish world into the world at large. Many a Christian has found him to be a source of great inspiration in their own religious faith and their own religious expressions. And why is that? Well, he lived from 1907 to 1972. He was 65 years of age. We just observed his yahrzeit just a little while ago. And what I think is important about Heschel was this. His biography is a synthesis of so much of what we're talking about. He begins as a child born into a Hasidic dynasty. He was a child prodigy. He will become in the course of his life what people might refer to as a crossover artist because of his mastery of very, very different genres and the different kinds of people as a result who really flocked to him. By the age of 16, he was ordained already as a Hasidic rabbi, but he wanted to go beyond that. He had this kind of restlessness about him and kind of secretly learned other languages that were not typically taught at the time. He was raised on Yiddish. He learned Polish, Latin, German. He left his Polish home for Vilna, became a Yiddish poet. He left his Vilna vocation because he wanted to study the philosophy of religion. And he earned that he became ultimately a PhD in that from the University of Berlin. So, but at the same time, he had more to offer. He became a Jewish educator par excellence. He picked up where Martin Buber left off with an adult education world of teaching in Frankfurt, the Lehrhaus experience and program, and taught there as well. And he became somebody who took within himself not only a variety of influences, but was able to be a master of language and conveying a variety of things. Now, unlike many people who began as very traditional Jews and jettisoned it, he ultimately created a synthesis where he made it and he refashioned it and created a spiritual dynamic for, yes, for conservative Judaism, but for the world, as I mentioned before, at large. He was deported from Germany to Poland 2 weeks before Kristallnacht, but there were Jewish leaders, especially through Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, who had a program to save Jewish scholars from Europe. They saw what was going on. They saved Heschel and brought him to Cincinnati, where he was saved and grateful for being saved, but it was really a fish out of the water. The Hebrew Union College, the Reform Seminary at that time, did not have a kosher kitchen. He had to have his own food in his own room. His teachings were kind of spurned sometimes by the students, and his manner of carrying himself as a traditional Jew was often spurned too, but he kept his mission to teach intact and ultimately was brought over to the Jewish Theological Seminary, where he resided for the next couple of decades or so. But I want you to look at these pictures for just a moment. Now, if you look at this, this is Heschel when soon after he first came to America. And you can't quite see the entirety of his garb, but I think it's fair to say this guy does not look like a Hasidic Rebbe. He looks like a good, solid American Jew, maybe American rabbi, scholarly because of the glasses, clean shaven. As time goes on, he looks like this in his study. The study was piled floor to ceiling with books, and it was, consistently being refilled with more stuff, right? You can see more of the penetrating eyes, the partial goatee of the beard that's returning, which is, I think, a mirror of what he was undergoing as he became a teacher, in which he was able to take all of the modern expressions of thought that he had, all of the experience of being a Jew immersed in the beauties of what he believed was his traditional upbringing, with modern understandings as well, with which he had encyclopedic knowledge. And he spoke and wrote in 7 languages, so there's no challenge in saying that he was a polymorph in so many ways. Here, he was perhaps in his 40s, maybe 50s. And here, the late Heschel, wild-eyed, wild hair. He was the polar opposite, by the way, in appearance from Kaplan, who's always, very, very meticulously and neatly groomed. By the time Heschel has this appearance, he is marching on the streets of Selma with Martin Luther King. He was inspired by his own academic work to say, it's not just about the prophets and what they have to say. And he wrote this gargantuan and very, very inspirational book on the prophets. But he was moved by the prophets to say, I have to act myself. A Jew must make a difference in the world. I can't sit in the study alone. And what does he do to help make that happen? Yes, he marches with King. He becomes a staunch opponent of the Vietnam War, which got him into a lot of hot water at the time. So did the civil rights work that he did. He became very involved in interfaith activities, did a great deal to bring Jews and Christians together, got the Vatican to change a lot of its attitudes and policies about the Jewish world. And he was an activist in so many ways. And as such, if you ever want to encounter at the same time the truth of the statement that the medium is the message, pick up Heschel and you will see what he is getting at. And here is just a tiny, tiny taste of what he had to say. Unlike the others we have seen before, God is not an idea. God is not the sum total of all sorts of things in the world that are beautiful and wonderful. But Heschel really believed, and this comes also inspired by what's called phenomenology and Husserl and the German idealists. God is not a theory. It's not a logical assumption. It's not about reason anymore, like Mendelssohn was so concerned about. But it is self-evident as light. God is not something to be sought. He is the light. God is a living, powerful, and deeply obvious, and for him, reality. And all of his teachings really, really focus around the idea of wonder. How can you wake up in the morning and see the sunrise and not be awed by the magnificence of it? And how, in a Heschelian term, how can you not connect that to the fact that not only is that connecting to the reality of God, but it's your business. It's your business to react to that. For Heschel, the worst sin is being numb, is being callous, is being in any way ungrateful to the miracles of daily life in the world. The world was not made by man, it's a gift. And this was, the language of the time, right into the 20th century as well. The world was not made by man. All that we own, we owe. Always be stunned and amazed by the realities around us. And for him, the quintessential Jewish deed was in many respects prayer. What he said was the mitzvah is not a folklore. The mitzvah is where God and man meet, his language. It's encounter, but not like Buber. It's not like seeing the notion of the total human potential of the next person, but rather it's where God is present in the reality of the divine. And prayer in many respects is the most powerful mitzvah of all, because it is, he would just describe the mitzvot as a prayer transformed into a deed. One other thought. A Jew in this world, it's not like Kierkegaard, not like Christianity. It's not a leap of faith. A Jew is asked to take a leap of action rather than a leap of thought. We're never going to be 100% aligned with what we ought to do. It's not about human autonomy anymore. It's about duty. It's about unrest, not having peace of mind because there's too much hurt. There's too much suffering. There's too much callousness. We have to surpass our needs. We can't be just bound by them. We have to do, and this is the polar opposite, if you think about it in a way, of Rosenzweig. Remember Rosenzweig, tefillin, you put them on? Not yet. We do more than we understand in order to understand more than we do. There is learning that comes only in the deep. I can't. And we have, I do have it. Just as to demonstrate our audiovisual bona fides here, Heschel apparently must have had some kind of a heart condition. And he was, quite ill in the latter part of his life. And just a few days before he died, he took a trip to Connecticut. He went to Danbury, to the federal penitentiary there, to meet Daniel Berrigan. You might recall him, the Berrigan brothers. Daniel Berrigan was being released from jail. He was one of the priests who fought against Vietnam, and he wanted to greet him. I think he was supposed to be a guest at Heschel's Friday night Shabbat table, if I'm not mistaken. And he caught cold, and he got very sick, and he ultimately died that Friday night. But just 2 weeks before he died, he gave his last interview. Some of you may recall Carl Stern's Eternal Light programs. And I want to give you just 2 minutes at the very end. And the setting for this is that Carl Stern said to Heschel, asked Heschel, what is it that you have to say to the youth of our country, of America today? And I'd like you to listen to it, not in terms of what does it mean about youth per se, but about anybody who could imbibe a little bit of what this message could be about and what's important. So just click on it. We're going to hope that the buffering and everything works. Let's see what happens.
Come back.
Existence, you don't talk about God and man. Yes. It's a sharing. Yes.
We're getting to that.
It's a
I can't see anybody. Folks, can you hear this okay? No, we're going to make it louder.
We just need to optimize.
Okay.
All right, we just have to readjust the sharing for a second. Sorry, everyone.
And this is the last thing we're doing tonight, and then we'll take some questions or thoughts or comments. So that's where we're at. So hang on if you don't mind.
Found in the Bible, strongly developed by the rabbis, and very little known. And that is that God suffers when man suffers. There's a very famous text that says, even when a criminal is hanged at the gallows, God cries. He says, woe unto me. He's very unhappy with man. There is this great sympathy of God and part of man. God identifies himself with the misery of man. I can help him by reducing human suffering, human anguish, and human misery.
We have just about a minute or so left. I should say at the start of this hour, before we began this hour, Dr. Heschel indicated an interest in directing a message at young people, and I don't know that I ever in the past hour gave you the chance I promised you that I would give you.
I would say to young people a number of things, and I have only 1 minute. I would say let them remember that there is a meaning beyond absurdity. Let them be sure that every little deed counts, that every word has power, and that we can do everyone our share to redeem the world, in spite of all absurdities and all the frustration, all disappointments. And above all, remember that the meaning of life is to build life as if it were a work of art. You're not a machine. When you are young, start working on this great work of art called your own existence. And the best way, and one of the ways of doing it, or two ways of doing it, is one, remember the importance of self-discipline. Second, study the great sources of wisdom. Don't read the bestsellers. And third, remember that life is a celebration, or can be a celebration. There's much of entertainment in our life. And entertainment is destroying much of our initiative. It weakens our imagination. What's really important is life as celebration. In a very deep sense, I would say that the addiction, the drug addiction, which so many people suffer, is due to the fact that man cannot live such a shallow life, stale. He needs exaltation. He needs moments of celebration. One of the most important things is to teach men how to celebrate life.
You talked earlier of slanders. May I give you an example of something which is not a slander? Perhaps the most astute comment on your work was made by Professor Marty of the University of Chicago.
Am I back on? Okay. I'm going to stop the share now. So I hope that you found a little bit of relevance in what he had to say. Just a brief Bethel historical note. It's my knowledge, and just from many conversations, that Rabbi Kessler of blessed memory was very influenced by Kaplan. We had a lot of talks about that. When it came time, though, to dedicate the new Bethel sanctuary in 1963, he chose Heschel. And Heschel came, and he was the one who dedicated our sanctuary. And I think now you might be able to see a little bit as to why that's the case. So I am done for right now. Thank you all for all of that attention. Let me take a look and see what we have in. No questions in chat. Does anybody have anything they'd like to just raise briefly? And we'll put it in the chat if you don't mind, so that we can maybe address it. I know it's a lot to absorb in a relatively brief period of time, so I appreciate your focus and your attention. Thank you so much for that. Okay. Anyone's typing? I don't know if you are. Okay, so we have chat things that are related to technical things and sound, but I think that's it. So something's coming in. Oh, you have something here. Okay, from Bobby and David, with the Jewish centers ever competitive with Oh, we have a lot of them. Okay, hang on. Okay, we'll take a few of these right now. Were the Jewish centers ever competitive with the synagogues? In point of fact, the Jewish center, are you talking about the JCCs? I don't know if that's what you had in mind. I think to some degree, there was this sense of, well, everybody better be offering, have a gymnasium, even if you, many synagogues did, even if the baskets were 2 inches away from the ceiling. JCCs, right. So I think there are, the Jewish world and its politics would be dull if there weren't competitive juices flowing from time to time. So I assume that that would be the case. But the reality was that there were probably different niches. In the best communities, there was kind of a symbiotic relationship between the JCCs and the synagogues. And there was a sense of, there are things that you're going to do better than we're going to be able to do, and vice versa. But we can have elements of culture in JCCs, and we can have elements of sports and arts and dance within synagogues, and that the two ought to be able to coexist with a reasonable amount of coexistence. So I think that that was the case. Did any of these thinkers influence Orthodox thinkers? Let's just do that one for just a moment. I think the answer is yes, in the sense of those in modern life. Again, as I mentioned, Orthodoxy is undergoing remarkable, interesting ferment. Not so much in the world of what we call the Haredi, loosely defined ultra-Orthodox world, but in the other elements of that world where there's talk about how do we get women involved and being treated in the same basis as men? How do we have women as rabbis? In the Orthodox world, how do all of these things happen? And the influence of all of these individuals was very, very great. Heschel had bona fides. He had all of this Orthodox training, what we would call Orthodox, very traditional training. And is the idea of the whole ongoing sense of synthesis becomes more of an idea even within the Orthodox world at large now. But they would probably have taken a stricter line on that. By the way, Susanna Heschel, who's Hartford Hyde, right? She went to Trinity, Abraham Heschel's daughter, who is very fond of our area, trying to get her back to speak here, was convinced that her father would have supported women as rabbis, and believed that that was the next step in his era. And he urged, in fact, Susanna to apply, even though they wouldn't have taken her at the time. He died 13 years before there was the first female rabbi in the conservative movement. Heschel's idea on the Holocaust is really very nuanced. On one hand, he calls himself an Ud Mutzal Me'esh. He quotes the prophet saying that I am a brand plucked from the fire and I am grateful for my life. He lost his family that haunted him throughout his entire days. But what he basically did was he refused to allow the pain of that to stop his, what he called his spiritual audacity in demanding that humankind become a far greater, more moral species. The reality was he blames humans for that, and he blames humans for the capacity for great, great cruelty and evil, and he railed constantly against that. And he said that either we create a living heaven on earth or we'll have constant hell. And that was largely his response and his reaction. He did not deal, in my knowledge, a great deal with where was God in all of this. As you heard him say, God suffered along with people, but he certainly did not blame God for it. He blamed humanity for it. That's in a nutshell. It's much more complex than that. How these thinkers, sermons and words of wisdom to others. First of all, I appreciate the notion that there are words of wisdom. I hope that they are. There are words. I hope that there have some element of wisdom to them. As you might imagine, many of these thinkers are background music in my mind, as many of us are. When I think of Judaism as a dynamic force that evolves and is a moderate kind of thing, as opposed to how perhaps Reform and Reconstructionism might have had it, I hear Solomon Schechter in the back of my mind. When we think about trying to create and talk about spirituality and to create modes of having that happen, Heschel is always in my mind. When we know that, I missed one slide, by the way, and I have to go back to it. Heschel marching.
Oh, yeah.
We have one last slide to show you. And I want to get to that just now because it's an important one, because of the timing of where we are. When I think that we are too complacent, and I want to have a reminder of what we ought to be. It's not this one. That's the one I want you to see. That's how I want it to end today. Heschel is on the left, Martin Luther King in the middle, Rob Abernathy on the right, somebody else you can't see in the picture carrying a Sefer Torah. Martin Luther King weekend is coming. This is the experience of what we need as a constant reminder. Heschel was never satisfied to sit in his study and to think thoughts. It had to be, this was one of the other questions, it had to be an expression of being there and doing for what a society needs. His famous statement was, in a free society, some are guilty, but all are responsible. In a free society, some are guilty, but all are responsible. Rabbi Kessler doesn't happen to be in this picture, I don't think, but he is in others. We have a famous one, it's in Bethel, of Rabbi Kessler and King together actually in Hartford at a rally. So I think, friends, I'm going to end here because I think this is as good a place to stop as we're going to have for tonight, because I would be prepared to go to midnight, but I am not so broad-minded to think that you are eager to go with me all quite that long. So thank you everyone for joining us. And next week we'll have our concluding session, and then we'll go forward. Have a wonderful evening.